Private schools never stop moaning and never stop lobbying.
It's your party that brought about the apartheid, and therefore the only thing you can do is destroy that which is good. The left merely destroys.
Comparison is the thief of joy. And if you never see how the rest of society lives, then you will never know how much you really have.
Do you really want to accelerate this exodus by banning private education? The top 10% of income earners contribute 60% of our tax receipts. Who's going to pay for state education if they all bugger off to Dubai?
So first up to speak for the motion, David Aaronovitch. Now, David can speak for up to 8 minutes. After 7, I will ring this bell and give him 60 seconds notice. At 8 minutes, I will ring the bell twice, and he will have to conclude his sentence. So, David.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here in front of the North Korean Parliament giving the speech. I'm very honoured to be here at a Spectator event, especially since the editor of the Spectator is a man I've known and liked for many years, well before he grew a reputation as a reforming Secretary of State for Education, and his former wife's recent memoir didn't make me admire his energy and endurance any the less. Hasn't taken away from him at all. Now, one iteration of this Spectator debate, this is the motion we've got at the moment, was the proposition that we should leave private schools alone. And I was more than willing to go along with this on the proviso that private schools left the rest of us alone, but they never do. In 2017, a former education secretary complained that private school educated people were massively overrepresented in the highest ranks of politics, business, the media, and sport. In some Olympian sports, it's practically 100% private school alumni, sports such as sailing, equestrianism, and so on. The state schools do get a very big look in sports like badminton and judo, because you don't need a lake or a boathouse or stables for judo. You only need the equipment, the thing that you stand up in. Now, in 2023, average private school fees were £15,200, where state spending per pupil was £8,000, a 90% difference. And that gap had more than doubled since 2010. Now, you might ask why. There's been a 75% increase in real terms in private school fees between 2000 and 2024. 75% increase in real terms. When the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, examined why, they said, this is funny because there are 9 pupils for every teacher in the private sector, which compares with about 18 for every pupil in the state sector, but the pupil-teacher ratio is around the same level as in 2010. So where had all this extra fee gone on? And it said it's therefore likely that higher private school fees have been spent on other resources, for example, other staff, facilities, staff pay level, extra costs, and so on. In September, this last September, the Telegraph's money reporter did a report in which he said many schools have effectively taken part in an arms race, spending tens of millions of pounds to build state-of-the-art infrastructure, often to attract overseas families. Brighton College spent £55 million on a new sports and science centre that opened in 2020. It features 18 laboratories, a cinema, and a rooftop running track. Eton College spent £21.5 million on an aquatic centre in 2020. Dulwich College has also spent £21 million in the past decade to build a science block. And this was the Telegraph reporter talking. And yet, private schools never stop moaning and never stop lobbying. So in 2019, the Sutton Trust published a paper which showed that 8 private schools sent 1,310 pupils to Oxbridge over 3 years. 1,310, 8 private schools. While over the same period, 2,894 other schools sent just 1,220 students between them. Now, what happened in that year when there was an attempt by the government, the Conservative government, and by the universities themselves to try and even this out even a little? A Mail story ran like this. Privately educated children are being edged out of places at Oxford and Cambridge by social engineering, was the headline. And they went on to explain that Anthony Wallersteiner, head of the £12,000 a term Stowe School in Buckinghamshire, said the plans to improve opportunities for underrepresented groups caused a fall in Oxbridge places for private school pupils. And he said, these children's parents are arguing it is social engineering and positive discrimination. As it happens, Stowe's fees have gone up 30% in the 6 years since he made that complaint. They spent £6 million in 2023 to build a design, technology and engineering building. The conventional figure is that private schools educate 7% of pupils in this country. In fact, it's nearer 6.5% once you exempt overseas pupils. As of 2024, after all this social engineering that was being complained about, the proportion of private school entrants to Oxford was nearly 34%, and Cambridge was 29%. That's one level of complaint. We're being discriminated against. Our poor kids are not getting into Oxbridge when they should, and all these other people from state schools are getting there who don't deserve it. This last year, we've seen the business of the VAT imposed by the government. Now, when it was just a proposition in May last year before the election, headlines ran like things like Labour's VAT plans blamed for fall in private school entries. They were blamed, of course, by the independent schools, that's where the figures came from, who had, just as it happens, just before the VAT, increased fees themselves by an average of 5.5%, which was not the rate of inflation, was considerably above. 19th of May in the Times, quarter of parents would quit private schools if VAT added to fees. And this was from a survey of people with investable assets of more than £250,000. 24th of May in the Times, grandparents empty savings to pay private school fees. Families are trying to find ways to prepay fees in anticipation of Labour adding VAT. Same day, they run a story from somebody, I'll send my son to India. Parents plan to beat VAT on private schools. One parent certainly did leave, former Sunday Times journalist Isabel Oakeshott, she of the Reform Party, educated at Gornston, and whose current partner is the multi-millionaire Reform Party MP Richard Tice, after having bemoaned the influence of Islam in the UK, one of her big things, took her children to be educated in Dubai to avoid VAT on school fees. And for those who don't know, the official religion of the Emirates is not Buddhism. For the last year, independent school pupil numbers fell by about 11,000, in fact, 1.9% year on year. Overall, pupil numbers across all schools fell by 0.7% over the same period. In other words, the great exodus never happened, as it was never going to. It was all privilege-protecting nonsense, as it always is. In 2023, average private school fees were £15,200, whereas state spending per pupil was £8,000, as I said, and that gap had more than doubled. Sorry? I couldn't hear you. Blimey, that might take long. Okay. So I just want to take you to what was said by a very famous Secretary of State for Education, charging very high fees and giving fee remissions which mostly benefit those who could be considered to be already wealthy can certainly be justified as lawfully charitable. Actually, this was an education charity and as delivering public benefit. But since schools are for the most part elite organisations delivering a paid-for and exclusive product, the extent to which this meets public perceptions of charity is questionable. You can absolutely say that again, which is what led this Education Secretary to say egregious state support to the already wealthy so that they might buy advantage for their own children was immoral. And she added, for every lucky scholarship boy or girl helicoptered out of poverty, for every Oliver Twist who graduates from the streets to Egyptian cotton streets, how many others are left behind like the rest of Fagin's gang? And this Education Secretary called for the ending of charitable status for private schools, saying that it was a stain on the country. Toby, who was that Education Secretary?
My boss.
It was Michael Gove.
Thank you, David. Well, we now turn to David Starkey to speak against the motion. David, you have 8 minutes.
Madam Chairman, can I remind the proposer of the motion of its actual wording, which was, this House believes that Britain would be better off without private schools. That is qualitative. He has given us a quantitative sort of analysis, which tempts me to the phrase of lies, damn lies, and statistics. He's also, of course, failed completely to register the would-be, the future conditional. Can I say I'm astonished at this opening? Because there was, in fact, a moment. He's talking as though this vision, this nirvana of a world without public schools is something to be in the future. It was, at a very important level, achieved on that day, that blissful day, when dawn it was to be alive and to be Andrew Marr was very heaven, when New Labour, renewed or whatever it is, Labour, was elected last July, because, as the Sutton Trust, which you've already mentioned, of course pointed out, that there was in fact 23 out of 24 cabinet ministers were educated as you choose in the state sector. Ladies and gentlemen, why was this not adduced? Why was not the Starmer cabinet held before us as the vision of the quality, the subtlety, the perfection, the honesty of the public sector, as opposed to this miserably over-subsidized field which the proposer of the motion has got himself lost in? Because can we be quite clear? Let's just read, actually, what the chap from the Sutton Trust actually said. It really is worth listening to very carefully. This cabinet is the most diverse, because they all went to state school, in terms of educational background ever recorded. It represents real progress towards smashing the class ceiling in politics, and it's the closest to genuinely reflect the proportion of Brits who went to comprehensive schools. This bizarre misuse of the word diversity, because they were all the same. Shall we listen? This really does seem to me, for a champion debater, a rather strange use of language. Shall we now listen to somebody who led the 19th century debate on education, which is John Stuart Mill on liberty. This is the greatest of texts on the subject of liberty, published in 1869, immediately after the Great Reform, the Second Great Reform Act, which gives the vote to my ancestors, the skilled working man, because my father was a toolmaker too. Anyway, all that has been said about the importance of individuality of character and diversity in opinions and mode of conduct, diversity, real diversity, not the mock diversity of race, but the real diversity of intelligence, of aptitude, of skill, of thought, involves, as of the same unspeakable importance, diversity of education. A general state, this is Mill, a general state education is a mere contrivance for moulding people to be exactly like one another. And as the mould in which it is cast is that which pleases the predominant power in government, whether it be monarch, priesthood, aristocracy, or the majority of this generation, in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it establishes a despotism over the mind, leading to a natural tendency to a despotism over the body. That's what he wants. That's what the Labour Party want. And this idea of a despotism established through state education is the more poisonous when we have, of course, a virtually complete takeover of the state's teaching sector by a peculiar and increasingly distrusted set, and I'm going to use the proper word, of lies. Some people call them noble lies, but they are lies which the population is beginning to rebel against. But can we actually put all this into its proper context? What I think, though it was very difficult to tell from the screed of statistics, what my opponent is wanting is abolition. He is wanting to destroy that which is good to make things better. That is a proposition as logical and as illogical as anybody can think of, but the reason why the Starmer government is such a disaster is not simply they're a product of a wretched and disnatured system of education. It is because New Labour, the kind of people that those on the other side of the House support and act as the intellectual proponents of, decided to do to the whole British state what they want to do to our education, which is to smash, destroy, and uproot. Ladies and gentlemen, if you smash, destroy, and uproot, and then salt the ground, there is no surprise when nothing grows. We in Britain are now experiencing the non-growth of radical change. Why visit it on education? Because again, let's just look a little harder. Those schools that have been denounced, those schools which may indeed, and I would be one here to pull back. I belong to a generation when the divisions between state education and private education were very much less extreme than they are now. And indeed, in the era of the grammar school, and remember, the great 1944 Education Act of Butler did exactly what Stuart Mill had wanted. It built on the extraordinary range of different kinds of schools. Some were historically endowed, some were religious schools, an extraordinary variety. Jewish, Quaker, my family is a Quaker family. Again, schools of very, very varied aptitudes and whatever, and it created potentially a remarkable structure. We all know, of course, there was a profound defect in that technical education, which again is a historic defect in Britain, wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been. But nevertheless, it provided opportunities to people like me. It created schools. Again, this denunciation of the private schools for their facilities. My little school, a school of 300, it had a proper gym, it had a proper swimming pool, it gave me the practice in debating, in acting, there was excellent music, there was art, there was the entire range, and you destroyed it because you decided it was too good. There were people, weren't there, like that leading Labour politician who said, because swearing was fashionable even then, I want to destroy every fucking grammar school. Once again, that Anthony Crossman, once again, that determination to destroy. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a gale of statistics without a serious argument, apart from relentless equality, dragging down the best in order possibly to drag up the worst. But we know it doesn't work like that. You demolish the good and everything else goes worse. Those are the fruits of that kind of language. We've seen them. We have a government that's founded on those principles. How could you possibly wish to generalize them?
I don't really need it.
Thank you, David. Now we move to Stella Tsantekidou.
You may have heard that in the UK, we have a problem with parallel communities. I agree. There are people in our society who refuse to integrate. They hold the rest of us in contempt, and they look down on our way of life. They dress differently and behave differently. They congregate in specific neighborhoods, and they crowd out everyone who is different from them. They don't clean up after themselves. They are the country's worst polluters. They vote for their own sectarian interests, for candidates who will not challenge their way of life and who will prioritize their values over those of the rest of us. Their white-collar crime, corporate welfare, and bank bailouts cost us, British taxpayers, billions. They even have their own language and refuse to speak ours. They say loo instead of bathroom and supper instead of dinner. Some of them even commit what for many of us is considered to be child abuse. We are not allowed to say it because we don't want to offend them. But how do you call it when a civilized society allows 7-year-old boys to be separated from their mothers? These segregated communities are so far away from the rest of us that their children can go through their entire childhood without ever interacting with 93% of British children. They have their own social networks, which operate entirely separately from the rest of us. They encourage nepotism within their communities and across society. They hire and promote people who sound and look like them. They even have a name for it. They call it the Old Boys Network. They're not embarrassed from it. That is how much we have indulged them. And you know what bothers me the most? We subsidize this. We give them tax breaks. We call these institutions charities. So tonight, I will be arguing that we should not tolerate parallel communities of any sort in the UK, especially those of the rich and the privileged. When privileged children are only surrounded by other privileged children, or children who are even more privileged than themselves, they grow up with distorted ideas about what life is meant to be about. I see this all the time in my British privately educated friends. Comparison is the thief of joy, and if you never see how the rest of society lives, then you will never know how much you really have. Some of the saddest men I've ever met in my life went to Eton. They spent their entire lives in an eternal competition with their classmates, trying to perform, to impress mommy and daddy. I knew one old Etonian who once told me that when his startup made his first million, his mother, rather than congratulating him, told him that he now has to repeat the trick over and over again until he dies. Now, I can't force rich people to stop purchasing education for their kids any more than I can stop them from buying designer handbags. But it is not good for British society when rich kids never interact with poor kids any more than I would suggest that it would be good if Muslim kids never interacted with Christian or Jewish kids. The contact hypothesis suggests that people who are exposed to a wide variety of social diversity develop more empathy with people from different social backgrounds. Now, here is where it gets messy. There are certain conditions for this contact. Ideally, it will be in a setting where people will have equal status between them, where there will be common goals, cooperation rather than competition, and some sort of institutional support. So what this means, sadly, is that if you're being served by a working-class waiter, that will not cut it. You have to take exams on the same desks and play sports on the same teams. The other problem with having rich kids educated separately from poor kids is that you're not just creating educational inequality, you're also creating a ruling class that fears and despises ordinary British people. And when I say this, I don't just mean that they become bigoted or xenophobic. No. Our trust fund babies, most of them, they go to school with the children of ruling elites from faraway countries. In fact, I'm sure many of them consider themselves to be very liberal and tolerant because they will behave very decently around the kids of plutocrats of all races and all ethnicities. However, they will consider ordinary British people to perhaps be bigoted or racist, even if they've never spent any considerable amount of time with an ordinary British person. This is the same mechanism, by the way, that ends up with newspaper editors writing articles about the stress of paying for 3 sets of private school fees while you have parents who can't even afford to pay for rent. Now, this may surprise you, because I hide it really well, but I wasn't born and raised here. And as an immigrant, it is obvious to me that the UK is one of the most open-minded countries in the world. France took credit for the Enlightenment, but I don't believe the French are anywhere near as enlightened as the British. In fact, it was John Locke, an English public school boy, who laid the foundations for the Enlightenment. And I know for myself that had I not moved to London and had gone to Paris or another European capital, I would not have been allowed to work in politics and appear on national television as quickly as I did here. However, when it comes to social mobility, the UK is one of the worst compared to other wealthy nations. British people were pioneers in establishing strict class rules. But British people were also pioneers in breaking class hierarchies. Britain invented the private school system, and Britain should be the one who will abandon it.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you. And finally, we move to Toby.
Thank you. So just to remind you of the motion, this House believes that Britain would be better off without private schools. Better off. Well, certainly not financially better off. As David more or less said, 6.5% of all school-aged children in England are educated in private schools. That's according to the Institute of Government, and that was in 24-25. There are 9 million school-aged children in England, so roughly 576,000. So the average cost of educating a child in a state school, as David said, is about £8,000 a year. So the annual cost to the state of educating all those children currently being educated at private schools, so if we abolished private schools, if we scrapped them in some way, did away with them, the state would then have to educate 576,000 children. That's 576,000 times £8,000, a cost of 4.6 billion a year. Better off. And where would those children go? The average cost of building an 8-form entry secondary school, including a 6th form, is about £47.7 million. That would accommodate about 840 pupils. So 576,000 divided by 840 equals 68.6. 68.6 times 47.7 million is 3.3 billion. That's how much we'd have to spend on building new schools to accommodate all the refugees from the now abolished private schools. Better off. At the moment, the parents of these children are contributing to the cost of state education via their taxes, but not actually using it. Why force them to start using it? Why look a gift horse in the mouth? So no, the country would not be better off financially if we did away with private schools. What about the practical obstacles? Article 2, Protocol number 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which I understood David and Stella supported, says no person shall be denied the right to education. And it's commonly understood by most education lawyers in this country that it would be enormously difficult politically to scrap, to abolish, for the state to somehow do away with private schools and not fall foul of Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. That protocol is understood to protect the right of parents to educate their children according to their religious and philosophical convictions. You may want a more integrated society, Stella, but if you're going to achieve that, in order to abolish private schools, in order to bring about the uniformity in the education that you seem to think is desirable, you would have to come out of the European Convention on Human Rights. So I take it you'll be voting Conservative at the next election. So even if Her Majesty's government could overcome this insurmountable hurdle, education is a devolved area of administration. So even if Labour won an election pledging to abolish private schools. It could only do so in England, at which point every single English private school would simply relocate to Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Even if by some miracle you could persuade all 4 governments of the United Kingdom to act in concerts, the schools would then simply migrate to the Gulf states. Last year, according to the ONS figures published yesterday, 257,000 British nationals left the country, the vast majority higher rate taxpayers. Indeed, it's estimated that a millionaire leaves the country once every 45 minutes. Do you really want to accelerate this exodus by banning private education? The top 10% of income earners contribute 60% of our tax receipts. Who's going to pay for state education if they all bugger off to Dubai? Better off without private schools. The country would go bankrupt. Okay, why stop? Why stop, David, at private education? If private education is so insufferable because it gives the beneficiaries an unfair advantage, why stop there? What about private tuition? Would you criminalize private tuition alongside private education? Because after all, that gives the children of rich parents an unfair advantage. Children of educated parents brought up in stable households with 2 parents have an unfair advantage. Are you going to do away with that? Are you going to criminalize reading to your children on the grounds that it gives those children an unfair advantage from children brought up in less stable, less educated households? Listen, David, Stella, I'll allow that the gap between private and most state schools is far too great. But the solution, the way to close that gap, is to improve state schools, not to force private schools to close. And that may sound utopian, but in 2009, I led the efforts, as Isabel said when she was introducing me, I led the efforts of a group of parents in West London to set up a secondary school. We were told no parents would want to send their children there. If you get ill, you wouldn't want to go to a hospital run by patients. So what sensible parent would want to send their child to a school run by parents? I remember Fiona Miller, that great champion of state education, laughing at me on Newsnight, saying, "Jeremy Paxman, I don't know why we're bothering to debate this. Toby will never succeed in setting up a school." Well, that school, the West London Free School, which opened in 2011, was named the Sunday Times London Comprehensive of the Year last year. This year, we got 13 pupils into Oxford and Cambridge, a far better haul than most private schools, and 60% of our A-level students, their grades were graded A to A star, compared to just 51% at Marlborough, where the Princess of Wales went to school and where the future King of England, the successor to the current Prince of Wales, is going to go to school. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to put private schools out of business, that's the way to do it. Don't ban them, just make state schools better. Thank you.
Contradiction of his earlier
I think we've wiped the floor.
Well, thank you to our 4 speakers for making their opening arguments. Now is the chance for them to take issue with each other's arguments in greater detail. I heard both sides muttering away as their opponents were speaking, so I'm sure we won't be short on points to make against one another. David Aaronovitch, I'm going to start with you because you were accused by David Starkey of wanting despotism, and I thought you might want to respond to that.
Well, it's interesting that both Toby and David have forgotten what the motion is. So they've spoken to the motion, this House would abolish private schools next year. The motion isn't that, and if it had been that, I wouldn't have agreed to speak to it. As it is, as I said, this is the 3rd iteration of the motion. It favours the opposition. We've agreed to do it because we're good sports, aren't we, essentially? But that's not the motion. The other thing is that if you want to see damn lies and statistics, David Starkey's incredibly lazy response to statistics he actually cannot dispute, then in that case you have to look at Toby's preposterous statistics. It's not just the idea that if private schools closed, everybody would go to Scotland, because you wouldn't, would you? I mean, let's face it, you wouldn't.
What's wrong with Scotland?
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't. If you were to look at the number of private schools just in this area and the fees they charge, then in that case, I think you can see you wouldn't be going off to Scotland and you wouldn't be increasing the number of boards. It's kind of absurdity. But did you not also notice that in Toby's speech there was a complete contradiction? The contradiction was this: if there weren't private schools, all these people would flood into the state sector and we wouldn't be able to afford it. And his second argument was, make the state sector so good that all these private sector students will go into the public sector and flood it. Which is it, Toby? I mean, presumably according to your first argument, we shouldn't want to do the thing that you conclude.
Which is it, Toby?
Well, I think the...
Oh, by the way, applaud, because that's actually a pretty good point, no other way.
And we applaud your bravery in coming into the lion's den. Toby, your response?
I'm delighted that David and Stella pride themselves on being good sports, a fine English public school principal. But I think, David, the answer to your question is, I think those who could afford to emigrate to Dubai, to other Gulf states, to other parts of the world where they could educate their children in keeping with their beliefs and their philosophical convictions would. That wouldn't be most of them. Most of them would be forced to send their children to state schools. And incidentally, the schools that they would choose to send their children to would be the highest performing state schools. So rather than advance the cause of social mobility, I think Stella's right to draw attention to flatlining social mobility in this country. But if you scrap independent schools, if you force the majority of parents, those who can't afford to emigrate, to send their children to state schools, they're going to make sure, they're going to use their sharp elbows to get their children into the very best state schools.
Is that what they're doing with your school?
No, we actually, well, the way we prevent that happening, David, the way we prevent that happening, that we prevent that happening from giving priority in our admissions arrangements to children on free school meals. But most high-performing state schools don't do that. And the upshot of scrapping private schools is that children who would otherwise benefit much more than the children of the rich from going to high-performing state schools will be forced to go to less good schools. So actually, you'll decrease social mobility rather than increase it.
Stella, that point about social mobility by postcode, we all know the rich catchment areas around good schools. I grew up in Guildford, where there was a very, very good school with very high property prices around it. And similarly, I live in Edinburgh, where it's unaffordable to live near the particularly good schools, state schools. So is there not social mobility is flatlining not just because of private schools, it's flatlining because of people's ability to afford to live near a state school?
All of this is a result of the fact that we have sheltered the ruling elite of this country from the educational outcomes that they think should be acceptable for everyone else. If we look at countries like Sweden or Finland or Germany, which is countries that we normally would look for in terms of educational attainment, their private school sector is almost non-existent, and everybody knows that the state schools' comprehensive education is the best education for most kids. And the way that they have achieved that is from having comprehensive education where every child goes. In Sweden, they did a small experiment for a few years where they started having some select private schools. And what they found is that actually it was worse for social mobility and worse for educational outcomes for everyone. The thing about saying that, oh, we're going to send these kids who go to these private schools and they have all of these amazing educational outcomes, and then if you send them to a state school, suddenly they will not be as good students, they will not get as good jobs. That is not the case at all. A very big factor in how somebody ends up doing in school and later on in life is their parents. Their parents and their background, and that doesn't change depending on what school they go. What does happen, so if you have a student who is going to do really well, they're going to do really well no matter where they go. What changes, however, by the social mixing that I'm talking about, is you allow students from backgrounds where they've never had exposure to the sort of kids whose parents give them books to read, they take them to museums, they give them cultural experiences that not all kids are privy to. You allow these kids to have another aspirational role model, a different social circle than the one they would have if you just told them, no, all the poor kids, they have to hang out with poor kids, and that's the end of it.
David Starkey, I'm going to come to you now.
I think I am, on the platform, the only person who was professionally involved in education of my years as a university teacher. I care about education. I don't see education simply, as my opponents seem to, as a social vehicle for bringing about a better integrated society, or for bringing about these wonderful words, social cohesion, or dealing with a multicultural society. I care about what people learn. I care about the idea of education as a process of the transmission of the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of previous generations to future ones. Most of our state schools do this job abominably, and it is demonstrable that they do. Public schools remain, I would argue, largely at the fag end of a serious tradition that did it. They were founded in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period, and particularly in the Renaissance period, they absorbed that extraordinary curriculum, going back to Cicero, of classical learning, which wasn't simply linguistic. It was the study of the history, the customs, religion of a remarkable, alien, but at the same time, foundational civilization. And that, ladies and gentlemen, laid the foundation of why Britain, why England transformed the world. We had, uniquely in Europe, a properly and fully educated upper class with a profound sense of public duty. It's absolutely true. Britain invents Britain, just let me finish.
Boris Johnson.
Wait.
Britain, you were allowed to speak at length and without interruption. If you wish to understand that and understand the truth of it, go and look in the National Portrait Gallery, go and look in Westminster, read Ronald Ashe's astonishing account of the invention of heroism in England, for the simple reason in continental Europe, with absolute monarchies, only a king was allowed to be a hero. That is a tradition that matters. I want it to continue. The very beginning of that tradition, there's a wonderful phrase of Chaucer. He talks about the idea of the fertility of the past. He says, just as each year out of the cold, dead ground comes new grain, so from old books new science springs. That is what education is about. It's not about social leveling. It's not about integration. It's not merely about practical matters. That is why civilizations exist, grow, and continue. And without it, ladies and gentlemen, in that miserable world envisaged from the other side of the platform, they die.
David.
Well, both Stella and David offered what I think were sort of mild reactions to that. So we'll go to Stella first and then David.
David, I have no problem with all the things you said, even though some of them are delusional. Doesn't matter. I'm totally in favor of having stories and narratives and all of these things about people and nations and all of these things. I'm totally okay with these things. I'm totally okay with symbolic stuff. I'm totally okay with beauty and whatever else. But why do you want to deny this to 93% of kids? Why do you want to deny this to kids who are not born without having any access to any sort of establishment figure anywhere near their family or their schools or anywhere else?
David Aaronovitch.
The snobbery in what David Starkey just said is just absolutely alarming. I mean, Toby Young steered clear of it wisely, in my opinion, but David absolutely exemplifies it. According to him, there is nearly no virtue to be found in where 93% of the population is educated. There's no diversity in that 93%. All the diversity he cares about is located within the 7%. That makes no sense at all, and it certainly doesn't make sense to people outside this hall, the vast majority of whom don't educate their kids in private schools and so on. I can understand why. I mean, one of the things that I thought about doing, but obviously didn't have the time, was to find out from the audience what proportion of you were entirely privately educated yourselves, what proportion of you, if you had children, had educated your children entirely in the private sector, because it will come back to a point that I was going to come on to later, and therefore how much vested interest you really had in justifying your own decisions at the expense potentially of other people during the course of this debate. Essentially, have kind of come on to hear yourselves justified. And in this case, your privilege is justified by a reference to national tradition. This country has national traditions that do not involve public schools and private schools. They have involved the labourers, the working people, the middle classes and so on, none of whom went to these schools, all of whom are considered somehow or other to be intellectually or morally unworthy of the terms that they are actually contributing significantly to the history and the present of this country. They are underregarded. And essentially what you're being asked to do is to support a system of privilege and the advantages that privilege give. The thing that I'm going to say before the end, by the way, is I think insofar as you have purchased that privilege and you have spent a lot of money on it, you have made a big mistake and you could have done better. And you've sometimes done it for really not good reasons with regard to your own children. But we'll come on to that in a bit.
Can I come in, Isabel?
Please do.
I rebut David's attempt to put any sort of distance between my colleague Dr. Starkey and myself. Like him, I find much to admire in independent schools. Not all, but many. I think they embody a great tradition of classical liberal education. Some grammar schools do too, some comprehensives do, but not many. And it's not right, David or Stella, to say that those benefits are confined to just the people that attend those schools. The West London Free School, for instance, is able to use many facilities at Latimer Upper School, which is right next door. There's a sharing of staff between Westminster and Westminster Harris Academy, which is the nearest school to where we are right now. Westminster put its money into creating Westminster Harris Academy, Harris Westminster, and that is an enormously successful sixth form. It's a state school, but it's incredibly successful because Westminster has successfully poured its DNA into that sixth form. Ditto Eton and the two London Academies of Excellence. Surely the answer, if we want to improve education for all, is to learn from what the very best schools are doing so well and emulate it, as many schools, like the West London Free School, have successfully done.
As we did with the grammar schools, which your party abolished and gloried in abolishing. The absolute contradiction of the arguments from that side of the platform. We used...
That wasn't a bell, that was a coffee cup. Let's continue.
And presumably we've got Quentin Hogg at the back, making gesturing noises. But it is the absurdity. We tried to do this. This is exactly what Butler tried to do, and with commendable success. There was also that careful blurring of boundaries with the direct grant. There were assisted places. Your party wanted to split them. Your party wanted to destroy them. It's your party that brought about the apartheid, and therefore the only thing you can do is destroy that which is good. The left merely destroys. It's really important we understand.
Toby, me next. Me next.
No, it's true.
£18,000.
It is true.
David, it's David Aaronovitch now.
Per pupil to
it is true.
£18,000 per pupil to £9,000 per pupil is not DNA, it's money, it's resources. It's got sod all to do with DNA. It's got everything to do with how much money gets spent. And none of you have answered the question of why it was when the Labour government, it was a Labour government, started significantly to improve educational standards in state schools, the response of the private schools was to put up their fees by 75% in real terms to make sure that they maintained the privilege and advantage that they'd had up until now. And if any of you think that you're going to get away with the idea that somehow or other you're maintaining fabulous traditions rather than purchasing advantage for your children or being the children for whom advantage is purchased over other people, because that's what advantage actually is, then in that case you're living in cloud cuckoo land.
Can I just point out,
David, please applaud, because that point was really good.
We should have given you a card, David,
The difference between our two sides is that David naturally gets applause. Poor David Aaronovitch has to beg for it. But I would just point out, David, that you say it's nothing to do with DNA, it's all to do with money. But if you'll forgive me for being a little bit personal for a second, you and I went to the same grammar school in North London, and in many ways that grammar school did try
Exactly.
and embody some of the virtues of public schools. It was named William Ellis after the inventor of rugby at Rugby School. Its motto was rather use than fame. It was the pupils were divided into houses. You could learn Latin there. I mean, it may not have had
We
the
debated,
facilities,
yeah,
it may not
yeah.
have been as rich as the schools it emulated, but nevertheless, that produced an extraordinary number of very successful pupils, not least yourself. So it is possible to inject
Yeah,
a
the
bit of
tense
private
right.
school DNA
okay.
into a
Tense
state
right.
school.
It was.
We're the proof of that.
Right, we're moving to Stella. Now, Stella, what is so wrong with parents wanting to purchase an advantage for their child? Is that not a very basic instinct of most parents, that if they have the money, however they've earned it, whether they're a taxi driver or whether they have done it through investment... In Edinburgh, there's quite a few taxi drivers who send their children to private school, actually. But what is wrong with that? What is wrong with trying to get an advantage for your child?
I do not demonize parents who want what's best for their kids. I definitely do not demonize. Sometimes when you talk about private schools, people will say, yeah, but I know that parent who is actually scrapping and shaving and not to get their kids into that private school because the local state school is so horrible. Blah, blah. Amazing. That is really honorable. It's a very honorable thing. It's a good instinct. It's really nice. We should encourage that in people to want to have more resources for their kids. But the problem is that education is not a material good. It's not the same thing as when you're buying a handbag or a pair of shoes. It's not the same thing as buying nice holidays. Now, obviously, we allow all of these other things. It is the kind of world that we live in. But education is something that makes you. It is what creates society. There are other purposes to going to school than just the sort of facilities that you use, and obviously the sort of social network that you have access to. If parents want these sort of things, then they can obviously go and buy extracurricular activities with their own money. They can go and buy social networks through private members' clubs, which they do anyway, and through the networks that they have anyway. But education, in the same way that universities are something that we consider should be open to the public, and should be open to everyone, it doesn't make sense that there is no other way for all kids to interact with all kids. Because when you don't do that, then you create parallel realities. And we understand this point very well, right? We understand why parallel communities are a bad thing when we talk about immigration and immigrants. And people will, the same people who are staunch advocates for private schools will tell you, will look you in the eye, and they will complain about immigrants only hanging out with other immigrants, and about schools that are 90% Muslim and there are no white kids, blah, 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 blah. So if that is a problem, I don't understand. Why do they not see the obvious problem of having rich kids who have zero idea how most of the world lives?
I think, Stella, your impression of what a typical private school student is like is a little bit out of date, if you don't mind me saying so. One of the reasons I didn't send my own children to private school is because I didn't want them to smoke wacky-backy, speak Jafaican, and become fans of Bob Vylan.